"If you dare kiss him," her friend whispered, voice trembling with excitement and mischief. I laughed nervously, my fingers brushing against the chilled glass of my soda, as I scanned the dimly lit bar filled with the usual Friday night crowd. Neon signs flickering above, casting erratic shadows across the hardwood floor. The dare had seemed harmless at first, a silly challenge to break the monotony of the week, but my heart was already racing in a way that had nothing to do with the carbonation in my drink. Across the room, a man sat alone, shoulders straight, posture rigid, a quiet intensity radiating from him that made the other patrons instinctively give him space without even noticing. Dark hair, eyes like storm clouds, the kind of presence that made the air feel heavier, and a hint of cologne that teased the senses from across the crowded bar. My friends nudged me forward, laughter curling around my ears like smoke, and before I could second-guess myself, my feet carried me toward him, the sounds of the bar fading behind me, leaving only the thump of my pulse and the echo of my own shallow breaths. I stopped just inches away, the man looking up finally, his gaze catching mine and holding it with a weight that made my knees weak, and then almost reflexively, I leaned in and pressed my lips to his, the briefest touch that somehow seemed to stretch forever. He froze just for a heartbeat, the world narrowing to the small space between us, and then slowly, deliberately, he leaned back, his dark eyes studying me with an intensity that made my stomach twist and flutter at the same time. I stumbled back slightly, cheeks burning, muttering a nervous laugh, trying to hide my surprise at how completely the encounter had stolen my breath. Around us, the bar carried on, oblivious to the collision of ordinary and extraordinary, but I could feel it in every shiver that ran down my spine. Something had shifted. He didn't speak, yet his silence carried the weight of unspoken authority, a magnetic pull that made it impossible to look away. My hands fidgeted with the hem of my sleeve, my ears ringing with the echoes of my friend's laughter somewhere behind me, yet I could feel his eyes, calm, piercing, all-encompassing, tracking me. And then, as if sensing the storm inside me, he inclined his head slightly, a gesture subtle yet laden with meaning, and I realized with a jolt that I had no idea who he was, that this simple dare had thrown me into a world I couldn't yet understand. My legs trembled, heart hammering, and I took a careful step back, trying to create distance, but his presence filled the space like sunlight through a window, impossible to ignore. A waiter passed, music thumped in the background, neon flickered again, but all of it was secondary to the weight of his gaze, to the quiet claim in the way he held himself, the suggestion of stories untold and power unspoken. I tried to breathe normally, to convince myself this was just a bar, just a man, just a dare, but a voice deep inside whispered that the rules had changed the moment our lips met. I didn't notice how close he had risen, subtle movements, precise, controlled, every step measured, until he was just a hand's breadth away, and then without a word, his eyes swept the room, taking in every detail, and for the first time I understood that there was more to him than the stern expression, the immaculately tailored suit, the quiet composure. There was a world behind those eyes, a weight and command that made my pulse stutter, and my instincts tangle in anticipation and apprehension. I swallowed, words caught in my throat, and all at once I realized that this simple dare had become something irreversible, something that would mark the beginning of a story neither of us had chosen yet couldn't deny. My mind raced, heart caught between fear and curiosity, and the faint hum of the bar seemed suddenly distant, replaced by the electric tension between us. A current that promised more than a simple kiss, that hinted at an unseen world where every glance could mean something, every gesture carried weight, and every second might change the course of everything I thought I knew. The bar had settled back into its usual rhythm, the low hum of conversation and clinking glasses filling the space, but I could feel his presence lingering like a shadow that refused to dissipate. Julian Mercer remained standing at the end of the room, posture still rigid, eyes sweeping across the crowd as if cataloging every detail, every movement, and then resting on me with that same piercing intensity that had made my stomach flip moments before. I tried to concentrate on the neon lights reflecting off the polished bar top, tracing their irregular patterns with my gaze, pretending to adjust my hair while my hands shook slightly, but I could not escape the awareness of him. Every instinct screamed caution, yet there was a strange pull that made it difficult to turn away completely. My friends nudged me, laughing at some forgotten joke, but their voices sounded distant, muffled by the tension that had settled like a heavy fog between us. Julian took a slow step forward, deliberate, measured, and the space between us seemed to shrink despite the crowd. his presence pressing into me with an invisible weight. I swallowed hard, heart racing, the taste of carbonated drink suddenly metallic in my mouth, and tried to steady my breathing. He did not speak, yet his silence conveyed authority, curiosity, and something else I could not quite name. The music shifted to a softer melody, a jazz standard that made the neon reflections ripple across the walls, and I realized the bar felt smaller, the air thicker, every sound sharper, as if the universe had compressed around the two of us. Julian extended a hand toward the empty stool beside him, a silent invitation, and I hesitated, caught between the urge to retreat and a curiosity that burned hotter than any fear. My fingers twitched, brushing against my drink as if seeking an anchor in the storm of sensations that consumed me, but I found none. He did not move yet, just watched, every motion controlled, every glance precise, and I felt the unmistakable impression that he could see right through me, understand the thoughts I had not even spoken aloud. My pulse surged as I took a tentative step forward, the floor beneath me warm and sticky from spilled drinks, the scent of citrus and hops mingling with something subtle yet unmistakably commanding emanating from him. Julian's eyes followed, unwavering, and suddenly the bar seemed to recede, leaving only the two of us in a space where time itself slowed, and I became painfully aware of the consequences of a simple, impulsive action. My mind raced through every possibility, imagining scenarios, anticipating reactions, yet none could prepare me for the quiet magnetism that radiated from him, an authority that did not demand words yet left no room for doubt. I took another step, more confident, curiosity outweighing caution, and Julian's lips curved into the faintest acknowledgement, a subtle gesture that was both invitation and warning, and I knew instinctively that this night was only the beginning, that the ripple caused by a single dare had expanded into something far larger than I had anticipated. My friends faded further into the background, the laughter and chatter dissolving into insignificance as Julian and I stood in the midst of the bar, separated by a handful of feet yet connected by an unspoken tension that promised to unfold in ways I could neither predict nor resist, and as I reached for my glass once more, I realized the ordinary world had already shifted irreversibly, the rules rewritten by a glance, a presence, a momentary collision of curiosity and fate. The stool beside Julian remained empty for several seconds that felt far longer than they should have, and I became painfully aware that every decision I made from this point forward seemed to carry more weight than it had 5 minutes earlier. The bartender polished a glass behind the counter, a couple laughed near the dartboards, and somewhere in the corner a song changed, yet all of it felt distant, as though I were watching the world through a pane of thick glass. I finally sat down carefully, leaving a respectful space between us. Julian did not immediately speak. He simply returned his attention to the amber drink resting in front of him, his fingers wrapped loosely around the glass. Up close, he seemed even more composed than before. His dark suit fit perfectly. His watch probably cost more than my car. Everything about him suggested a life completely different from mine. I cleared my throat and offered a nervous smile. I should probably apologize. His eyes lifted toward me. For what? His voice was deep and calm, carrying the kind of confidence that never needed to be raised. For the whole random kiss thing. Heat rushed into my cheeks. My friends dared me. For the first time, the corner of his mouth moved slightly. Not quite a smile, more like an acknowledgement. And do you always accept every dare? I laughed softly. Definitely not. Then why that one? The question caught me off guard. I looked down at my hands. Honestly. He gave a small nod. You looked impossible to talk to. That finally earned the faintest reaction. His eyebrow lifted slightly. Impossible. You were sitting alone. Serious. Like you were judging everyone in the room. And your solution was to kiss me. I groaned and covered my face for a second. When you say it out loud, it sounds much worse. A surprisingly comfortable silence settled between us. For reasons I could not explain, my nervousness began to ease. There was something strange about Julian. Intimidating, yes. Mysterious, absolutely. Yet beneath the sharp edges was a patience I had not expected. He listened carefully. He never interrupted. He seemed interested in every answer, even when I was rambling. What is your name? He finally asked. Ava. Ava Sinclair. My stomach tightened. How do you know my last name? His expression never changed. Your friends have said it 3 times in the last 10 minutes. I glanced over my shoulder. Sure enough, my friends were watching us from across the room with the subtlety of a marching band. Embarrassment washed over me again. Julian followed my gaze before returning his attention to me. You seem close to them. Since college. Good friends are rare. Something in the way he said it made me wonder if he was speaking from experience. Before I could ask, the front doors opened and a cold gust of night air swept through the bar. Several men entered. They were well-dressed, confident, and immediately began scanning the room. The moment they spotted Julian, their posture changed. Not dramatically, just enough for me to notice. Respect. Deference. One of them approached and leaned down slightly, speaking quietly near Julian's shoulder. Julian listened without looking away from me. The brief exchange lasted only seconds. Then the man stepped back. Everything okay? I asked. Yes. Work. A small pause followed. Something like that. The answer should have satisfied me, but it only deepened my curiosity. The men remained nearby, pretending to occupy themselves while clearly waiting for him. Suddenly pieces that had not fit together before began sliding into place. The way people avoided his table, the authority in his voice, the reaction of the men who had just arrived, the impossible confidence. My pulse quickened again. I looked at Julian more carefully this time, and for the first time that night a quiet thought slipped into my mind. I had absolutely no idea who this man really was. The bar seemed smaller now, the hum of conversation fading into a muted backdrop as my thoughts raced faster than my pulse. Julian Mercer sat with an effortless composure that seemed to bend the space around him, his eyes flicking briefly to the men lingering near the entrance before returning to me with that unwavering intensity. I took a sip of my soda, though the fizz did nothing to steady the sudden nervous flutter in my stomach. The neon lights above painted streaks of red and blue across the polished wood floor, their reflections dancing like restless spirits that mirrored the jittering of my hands. I shifted slightly, careful not to knock over my glass, and felt a flicker of warmth as Julian's gaze followed each movement, as if noting the subtle tremor in my fingers or the way I tucked a strand of hair behind my ear. The air between us was charged in a way I could not define, a quiet tension that made each second feel heavier, more deliberate. I tried to focus on the music, a soft jazz tune now, letting the saxophone notes thread through my ears, but Julian's presence anchored me in a different kind of rhythm entirely, one that I could not predict or control. A waiter passed by, the scrape of shoes and the murmur of conversation a reminder that the bar was full of ordinary people, yet they all seemed like extras in the scene that had unfolded around us, insignificant compared to the gravity that radiated from the man across from me. Julian leaned back slightly, his hand tracing the rim of his glass with precision, and I noticed the subtle tension in his shoulders relax just a fraction, a small window into a man who carried more control than I could comprehend. I realized then that despite my initial shock, despite the adrenaline still tingling along my nerves from the sudden proximity and unexpected contact, there was something compelling about him that went beyond curiosity or attraction. It was the certainty, the calm command that suggested every movement he made was calculated, deliberate, and yet not intrusive. I cleared my throat, words catching in my throat, and attempted to speak, though my voice sounded small against the cavernous presence of the room and him. "Do you come here often?" I asked, forcing a laugh that felt brittle like fragile glass. Julian's lips twitched in a faint acknowledgement, a shadow of humor or perhaps something unreadable, and he finally spoke. "Not often. I prefer quieter evenings." His tone was calm, almost casual, yet carried the weight of intention that made me pause. "And yet tonight you sat in the middle of a crowd, unnoticed by all except me." I felt my cheeks burn again. I guess luck runs differently sometimes. He leaned forward subtly, the motion almost imperceptible, but the effect was undeniable, pulling the space between us taut. "Luck," he said, voice low, deliberate, "is not always what it seems." I nodded, heart hammering, sensing layers in his words I could not yet understand. Around us, the bar continued its normal rhythm, glasses clinking, the bass line vibrating softly underfoot, but all of it felt secondary, irrelevant, to the gravity in his presence. My hands tightened around my glass, realizing that this interaction, this single evening, had already begun to reshape the way I perceived the room, the night, and the stranger whose eyes held the kind of depth I had never encountered before. Julian's gaze softened just a fraction, and in that instant, the world felt suspended, poised on the edge of discovery, anticipation, and the unspoken promise that the evening was far from over. For a moment neither of us spoke. The silence felt different now, no longer awkward but strangely comfortable, like standing beneath the first drops of rain before a storm arrives. I glanced toward my friends again, expecting them to still be watching, but they had finally returned to their own conversations, leaving me alone with the consequences of my impulsive decision. Julian seemed to notice the direction of my gaze. "They trust you," he said. "What makes you say that?" He lifted one shoulder slightly. "They stopped worrying." I followed his logic and realized he was right. Earlier they had been staring constantly, checking on me every few seconds. Now they seemed relaxed, comfortable. "Maybe they think I can handle myself." "Can you?" His question was simple, but something about the way he asked it made me pause. I had always considered myself independent. I paid my own bills, worked full-time, took night classes twice a week, solved my own problems. Yet sitting across from him, I found myself questioning why his opinion suddenly mattered. "Usually," I answered honestly. Julian studied me for a second. "That is not the same as always." Before I could respond, one of the televisions mounted above the bar switched to a local news channel. The volume remained low, but a familiar city skyline filled the screen. A reporter stood outside a downtown building discussing a major business acquisition. I barely paid attention until the camera shifted to a photograph. My eyes widened slightly. The man on the screen looked familiar. Not identical. Not a perfect match. But similar enough that I looked back at Julian. Same dark hair. Same sharp features. Same calm expression. My pulse skipped. The photograph disappeared before I could read the name displayed underneath. Julian noticed my reaction immediately. "Something wrong?" "No," the answer came too quickly. He tilted his head slightly. That sounded convincing. I laughed nervously. "I thought I recognized someone on television." "And did you?" "Maybe." His eyes narrowed just enough to suggest amusement. "You are curious. That is a dangerous accusation. Is it inaccurate?" I opened my mouth and then closed it again. The truth was impossible to deny. I was curious. About him. About the men waiting nearby. About the invisible gravity that seemed to surround him. Most of all, I was curious why I felt completely safe sitting beside someone I knew absolutely nothing about. The front door opened again. Cold air swept across the room. Outside, rain had started falling, tiny droplets streaking across the windows beneath the glow of streetlights. The weather forecast had promised clear skies all evening. Apparently it had been wrong. "Great," I muttered. "I parked 3 blocks away." Julian glanced toward the rain-covered glass. "You walked. It is downtown. Parking is impossible." "Fair point." Thunder rumbled softly somewhere in the distance. Not loud, just enough to make several people glance toward the windows. I checked my phone. Nearly midnight. Much later than I had realized. I should probably go. The words felt strange coming out of my mouth. Part of me expected relief. Instead, I felt disappointment. Julian remained quiet for a moment. Then he slowly stood. The movement immediately caught the attention of the men waiting near the entrance. They straightened instinctively. Again that reaction. Again that unmistakable respect. My curiosity deepened. Julian reached for his suit jacket and slipped it on with practiced ease. Then he looked directly at me. "Ava." Hearing my name in his voice sent an unexpected warmth through my chest. "Yes." His expression remained calm, unreadable. "I have a feeling this will not be the last time we meet." The certainty in his words should have sounded arrogant. Instead, it sounded like a fact neither of us had discovered yet. His words followed me long after I stood from the stool. I tried to laugh them off, to treat them like the confident remark of an attractive stranger, but something about the certainty in his voice stayed with me as I grabbed my coat and said goodbye to my friends. The rain outside had intensified. Droplets raced down the windows in silver streams, blurring the city lights into watercolor streaks of gold and blue. I pulled my coat tighter around my shoulders and stepped onto the sidewalk immediately. greeted by cool air and the scent of wet pavement. Midnight in the city carried its own rhythm. Taxi headlights reflected across the streets. Neon signs buzzed softly overhead. The distant sound of sirens blended with the steady percussion of rain against concrete. I started walking toward the parking garage 3 blocks away, carefully avoiding puddles that had formed along the curb. My heels clicked against the sidewalk, the sound oddly loud in the quiet night. For the first minute, my thoughts remained tangled around Julian. The way he spoke, the way people reacted to him, the strange feeling that he knew more than he revealed. I found myself replaying every conversation, every glance, searching for clues I might have missed. Then my phone buzzed. A text message from my friend Chloe appeared on the screen. "Are you alive?" I laughed despite myself and typed back quickly. "Barely." Another message arrived immediately. Who was he? That question stopped me. I stared at the glowing screen while rain dotted the edges of my coat. Who was he? The truth embarrassed me. I had spent nearly an hour talking to him and still knew almost nothing. I knew his name. I knew he preferred quiet evenings. I knew people listen when he spoke. Beyond that, he remained a mystery. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and continued walking. The parking garage entrance appeared ahead beneath a flickering light. Relief settled into my chest. Then a black luxury SUV slowly rolled to a stop near the curb across the street. I barely noticed at first. Expensive vehicles were common downtown. But as I crossed toward the garage entrance, the driver's side window lowered slightly. One of the men from the bar sat behind the wheel. My steps slowed. He offered a polite nod. "Miss Sinclair." Hearing my name immediately sent a pulse of surprise through me. "Yes. Mr. Mercer asked us to make sure you arrived safely." For a second I simply stared. Rain tapped against the roof of the vehicle. Traffic lights reflected across the glossy black paint. "He did." The driver nodded once. "The weather is getting worse." I looked up. The rain had become heavier, wind pushing water sideways through the streets. "That is thoughtful," I admitted. The driver offered a professional smile. "Mr. Mercer tends to be thorough." Thorough. The word lingered in my mind. Not controlling. Not possessive. Thorough. As if making sure I got home safely was simply another item on a list he had already decided to complete. I thanked the driver and continued into the garage, but my heart felt strangely lighter. By the time I reached my car, I realized I was smiling. It made no sense. I barely knew him. Yet somewhere between the dare, the conversation, and the unexpected gesture, Julian Mercer had become impossible to ignore. And as rain hammered against the roof of my car while I started the engine, I could not shake the feeling that our story had already moved beyond coincidence and into something neither of us fully understood. The drive home was quiet, rain pattering steadily against the windshield, each drop a tiny percussion on the roof of my car. Streetlights stretched reflections across the wet asphalt, elongating cars, pedestrians, and neon signs into streaks of color that blurred as I moved. My mind replayed the evening over and over, analyzing every detail, every subtle gesture from Julian Mercer that hinted at the depth of his world beyond what I had seen. I could not deny the curiosity that had taken root, the sudden awareness that the ordinary city streets now felt somehow smaller, constricted, as if the city itself had bent around the events that had unfolded. The intersection ahead glimmered under the streetlights, puddles reflecting the red and green of the traffic signals, and I slowed, careful not to skid on the slick pavement. My fingers wrapped around the steering wheel as I forced myself to breathe evenly. Though my pulse remained elevated, thoughts chasing themselves in endless loops. Who was he really? Not just the man at the bar. Not just the stranger who had accepted a dare. The way people had moved, the subtle acknowledgement from his companions, the weight of his presence in the room, all of it suggested something far beyond anything I had encountered. I tried to distract myself by focusing on the music playing softly from the radio, but even the gentle notes of a familiar jazz song could not quiet the questions tumbling through my mind. The memory of our conversation, his words about thoroughness, the unspoken understanding between us, kept echoing in my head. A flicker of movement outside caught my attention, the silhouette of a pedestrian rushing to avoid the rain, and I felt a brief pang of normalcy, grounding me in the real world. Yet the shadow of curiosity persisted. Julian had an air that made ordinary acts significant, that could make a casual glance or a simple gesture resonate with weight and meaning. I realized with both apprehension and fascination that I was not just thinking about him. I was analyzing him, tracing every nuance, every calculated motion, as if trying to understand the rules of a game I did not yet know I was playing. A horn blared in the distance, pulling me back to the road, and I pressed the accelerator gently, the engine humming beneath me, merging rhythmically with the tapping rain. By the time I reached my apartment building, the night had deepened, the city quieted into a subtle murmur. Yet the weight of his presence lingered inescapable. I parked and sat for a moment, listening to the windshield drip and the distant echoes of footsteps on wet sidewalks, my hand still gripping the steering wheel, wondering how one chance encounter, one dare taken on a whim, could ripple across an entire night and make the ordinary feel anything but. I stepped out of the car, coat pulled tight against the cool rain, and as I approached the building entrance, I realized the anticipation, the pull, and the unasked questions would not fade, would not be easily ignored, because somewhere deep down I understood that Julian Mercer was not a man I could simply walk away from, not even if I tried, and that thought sent a shiver through me as I entered the lobby, leaving the wet night and the city streets behind, carrying only the echo of a presence I could neither name nor dismiss. The following morning arrived with a gray sky and the steady drizzle of lingering rain, the streets glistening wet as early commuters scurried beneath umbrellas. I stepped out of my apartment building, coat pulled tight, keys clutched in one hand, and the chill in the air reminded me that last night was more than a fleeting encounter. Every step toward the corner cafe felt weighted with anticipation, the thought of seeing Julian again threading itself through every mundane motion. The bell above the cafe door jingled softly as I entered, the aroma of fresh coffee and baked bread mingling with the faint chatter of early patrons. Julian sat at a corner table, his posture unchanged, back straight, dark suit still impeccable despite the rain. He looked up as I approached, eyes catching mine with that same intensity that made the city seem smaller, every other noise fading into background static. I swallowed, pulling the chair across from him, and for a moment we simply regarded each other, the room around us becoming a stage set for a conversation that carried weight far beyond the ordinary. "Good morning," he said finally, voice calm, even, but carrying an undercurrent of expectation. "Morning," I replied, voice quieter than usual, aware that even casual greetings seemed to carry meaning here. He nodded subtly, acknowledging me without speaking further, and I realized that even the simplest interactions with him required careful attention. "Coffee?" he asked, gesturing toward the steaming cup in front of him. I nodded, thankful for the normalcy of it, though the sensation of sitting across from him felt anything but ordinary. The baristas moved behind the counter, placing orders and cleaning surfaces, but Julian's gaze remained on me, evaluating, measuring, unspoken rules tracing lines across the distance between us. I sipped the coffee, warmth spreading through my hands, and found myself drawn into a rhythm that seemed dictated by him. We began to talk at first about neutral things, the weather, the city, mundane observations, but each sentence felt charged, weighted, as though every word had the potential to carry more than its surface meaning. I found myself revealing small details, and he listened intently, not interrupting, yet I sensed him filing each fragment away, connecting them in ways I could not yet perceive. A soft smile touched my lips, the tension easing slightly as conversation carried us forward. Yet, underlying everything was a quiet understanding that this was not a simple meeting, not a casual coffee. The intensity of his presence demanded attention, yet it did not overwhelm, it simply claimed a portion of the space around me, subtle and precise. As I rose to leave, stepping back into the rain-soaked streets, I felt the weight of anticipation lingering, knowing that our story was only beginning, that the rules had shifted, and that Julian Mercer was a man whose influence stretched beyond simple encounters, into moments that would ripple across every ordinary day in ways I could not yet imagine. The rain had slowed to a steady drizzle by the time I reached my apartment, the city lights reflecting off wet pavement and casting long, distorted shadows that stretched across the sidewalks. I paused at the door, keys in hand, and for a brief moment allowed myself to linger on the events of the past night and morning. Julian Mercer had become more than a fleeting encounter, more than a stranger whose presence had pulled me into a world I had not known existed. The memory of his steady gaze, the subtle gestures, and the quiet authority that seemed to ripple outward from him filled my mind like a slow-burning realization that something had shifted irrevocably. As I stepped inside, the familiar scent of my apartment greeted me, yet the ordinary surroundings felt smaller, more confined, almost as if the space could not contain the weight of the connection that had begun to form. I set down my keys and coat, my fingers lingering on the doorknob, tracing its familiar contours as if grounding myself in the normalcy of everyday life. I walked to the window overlooking the street below, watching pedestrians hurry beneath umbrellas, neon reflections bouncing across puddles and wet asphalt. The city moved on, oblivious to the small moments that had unfolded within the walls of a bar and a corner café, yet I could not shake the sense that the night had altered my perspective, that ordinary interactions now carried potential significance in ways I had not anticipated. My phone buzzed, a message lighting the screen. "Chloe, did he leave? You alone?" I smiled faintly, typing back, "Yes, but he made sure I got home safe." The words felt inadequate, incapable of capturing the tension, curiosity, and subtle awareness that had developed. I leaned against the sill, sipping the remainder of my coffee, letting the warmth spread slowly through my hands, and reflected on the way Julian had moved, the calm precision in every action, the way he commanded attention without raising his voice or forcing it. Something about him demanded observation, understanding, and a careful awareness of timing and nuance. The realization settled into me with a curious mixture of apprehension and fascination. I was drawn in, despite myself, into a pattern I could neither predict nor resist, and each thought of him carried the same quiet gravity as if the city itself had shifted around his presence. A soft breeze drifted in through the slightly open window, carrying the distant murmur of traffic and the faint scent of rain, and for a moment I let my mind wander to the subtle smile he had given me in response to an ordinary question, the way he had noted my hesitation without judgment, the way a single glance could hold more meaning than 1,000 words. I sank into my chair, the cup of coffee warming my palms, and realized that our story had begun not with words or explanations, but with the intersection of curiosity, chance, and quiet observation. In that instant, I understood that the night, the rain, and Julian Mercer had left an indelible impression, one that would echo through every ordinary day and every ordinary interaction, subtly reshaping the rhythm of my life in ways I could not yet comprehend, leaving me aware that this was not the end, but a beginning that demanded attention, presence, and the willingness to step into an unknown world where ordinary rules no longer applied.